Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2, where we're going to take a look at some urban warfare basics. There are a lot of acronyms for this, like MOUT and FIBUA for military operations in urban terrain and fighting in built-up areas. Personally, I prefer efficient ships, fighting in someone's house and causing havoc in people's streets. So what we're going to do here is look at a firefight in a playthrough of the Alamara scenario that I've done. If you want to try your hand at this, it's there in the base game. Go ahead and have a go. Playing against the AI is never the same as playing against a human being, but it's good for getting to grips with the game and familiarizing yourself with new weapons, vehicles, equipment, and tactics. The scenario essentially involves two US striker platoons clearing the edge of a town. We're going to go over a firefight from the initial break-in. In the last 3 firefight videos, we basically explored how to make the most of our firepower with a pretty simple formula. Find the enemy, suppress the enemy, then close with and destroy the enemy. Ideally, we want to find the enemy from as far away as possible, and then suppress him from outside his effective weapons range with machine guns, mortars, or other heavier weapons. Once he's suppressed, we can advance inside his effective weapons range in relative safety to finish him off. But in dense terrain with restricted sightlines, like forests or urban areas, we're probably going to encounter the enemy suddenly at close range. So firefights are going to start off inside the effective weapons range of an unsuppressed enemy. Everybody is going to be blazing away at each other, and as one side inflicts casualties and suppresses the other, the balance is very quickly going to tip in their favour. So firefights in dense terrain are more like contests of local immediate firepower, and the more firepower we have up front immediately available, the faster we can gain fire superiority and the less time the enemy has firing away at full effectiveness. This is the situation we have out on the left early on in Alamara. We're trying to break into the town over the top of this highway embankment, and as 1st Squad 3rd Platoon out on the left peeks over the crest, they're engaged by enemy unconventional troops. The uncons are in the second row of buildings, and one armed with an SVD marksman rifle opens up on our US troops through a gap in the first row of buildings. This is a kind of keyhole position. If we want to engage the enemy, we can only do it through a fairly narrow aperture. It's a way of controlling exposure in dense terrain like this. If the enemy can put more effective firepower through that gap than we can, then we've got a problem. Unfortunately for the insurgents, I've got a whole squad up here. I have a lot of firepower forward, and both M249s can fire into the gap. The marksman is quickly dealt with, but buildings offer very good concealment, and there are a lot more insurgents in there than I was expecting. We quickly get a pretty toasty two-way range. This is dangerous. All these bullets are lethal, and the uncons get a couple of RPGs off that are definitely not something I want connecting with my troops. But in the same way that the enemy are using a keyhole position to minimise their exposure to my fire, I'm using the embankment to minimise my exposure to theirs. The Americans are kneeling just behind the crest, where they present a very small target, and if the incoming fire becomes heavy enough to make them cower and go prone, they'll drop out of sight completely. Obviously, there aren't going to be convenient embankments in every urban firefight you get into, but exploiting the terrain or finding other ways to restrict the angles the enemy can engage you from are a good means of reducing the effectiveness of enemy fire at these short ranges. We can also see some of the way that Combat Mission handles building interiors. The inside of buildings are abstracted. That level of detail is a bit too much for the scale of the Combat Mission model, so internal walls, furniture and stairwells aren't drawn in. Instead, each floor looks like a single big empty room, and the game applies a bit of RNG to affect spotting, firing angles and cover to represent what's going on inside. This is less of a big deal than it might sound, because buildings are not particularly bulletproof anyway, as these insurgents are quickly finding out. At the end of the first turn of contact, our US squad hasn't taken any casualties, and I can make the call on whether to disengage or carry on. Seeing as though I've killed a couple of uncons already, and I can bring the squad's striker into the fight with its Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, I feel like I can push the advantage in this fight. Again, I have plenty of firepower, up front, ready to go. Soon, the insurgents are getting pretty effectively pasted. It looks like they're taking heavy casualties. This is more of an important point to make than it might sound. The popular image of urban warfare is very much stack up, breach and clear. It's very dynamic and it looks cool, but it's also ridiculously risky. Not only is storming the fatal funnel likely to be, well, fatal, but this popular image doesn't usually go beyond the target building itself. The most dangerous areas in an urban environment aren't the buildings, they're the streets. Tunnel visioning in on the building you want to assault leaves you exposed to any number of other enemy positions using the open, coverless ground in between the buildings as kill zones. Here, we're shooting the crap out of the enemy building through a keyhole with minimal exposure to other enemy units. We've got a decisive advantage in firepower and we're stacking bodies. So why bother taking the risk of punching up to that building and physically clearing it? It's all about the application of firepower, and in combat mission at least, the enemy can't hide under the bed or in the toilet, so we don't actually have to go in and clear buildings, we can clear them with firepower alone. After a few turns of abuse, it looks like the uncons in the building have gone quiet. They might all be dead, they might have run out the back door, or they might be biding their time. Similarly, the platoon has variously destroyed or driven off all the enemy contacts it can see from its current position on the embankment, so it's time to advance and find some more. We're moving down the slope to occupy the first row of buildings, again in strength, so that we have a lot of firepower forward to deal with any new contacts that pop up. On the left, I've split first squad down into its 3 teams. 3 teams because it's the MOUT organisation of the rifle squad, which is slightly different. One of the dilemmas in urban warfare is that you need to concentrate firepower, but concentrated pixel truppen are vulnerable. We want maximum volume of fire, but at the same time we don't want a single hand grenade or RPG to wipe out the whole squad. Finding the right balance here can be tough, and the balance will be different against different enemy units and in different types of urban terrain. What I've done here is put 1 team in each of the 3 buildings on the left and punch the teams inside simultaneously, which was probably a good move. There are surviving insurgents in the building we shot up, most likely the smart ones who went downstairs where we couldn't see them. So we get another exchange of fire. The Americans have enough firepower to overpower the enemy. After all, we've done a good job of grinding them down to this point, but there's an RPG-29 gunner who manages to get a round off before he goes down. The rocket takes out 2 US soldiers across the street. Fighting at these close ranges is a lot harder for the enemy to miss, and pixel truppen do have a habit of congregating around windows. But on the next turn, the uncons are quickly finished off. There are about 20 bodies in their building, far more insurgents than we ever actually saw, and we cleared it out without ever setting foot inside. That was an example of a firefight without any supporting elements, basically a frontal attack on an enemy position. It can be done, and it can be done with relatively few casualties, but that doesn't stop it being risky. There's a lot that can go wrong, and it's important to remember that the enemy is setting up in dense terrain because it makes it harder for us to apply our firepower. He's trying to make it a more even fight. So ideally, we should try and avoid urban areas if we can. Obviously, that's not always possible, so here's a few more tips that should help. Remember that it's all about firepower. It's much better to send a bullet instead of a pixel truppen, and it's better yet to send 1,000 bullets, or a missile, or automatic cannon fire, or tank rounds, or heavy artillery, or a 1,000-pound bomb. If we have a way to kill the enemy or destroy the building they're in without us ever getting anywhere near it, then excellent, off we go. It's also important to remember that the streets and open areas are the most dangerous parts of urban terrain. So if possible, we want to keep off the streets and minimize the exposure of our troops. This might require some imagination and minor urban remodelling. Breach teams, engineer teams, and specially organised MOUT squads with demolition charges are fantastic at opening up new routes. It's much safer to mouse hole our way through a row of buildings using the blast command than it is to go outside. And of course, we can also use the streets as our own kill zones. Open spaces are just as dangerous for the enemy as they are for us, so if we can force the enemy out of his buildings and into the street where cut-off forces can fire on him, then he's going to stop being a problem a lot faster than if we have to root him out. This gives us a bit of a template to use. One force attacks the enemy building or block of buildings, while the other isolates the area and stops the enemy from reinforcing or falling back. Finally, the original setup of maneuver element and base of fire, with one suppressing the enemy position until the other gets close enough to finish it off, isn't something we should stop doing just because we're in an urban area. If we have the line of sight to set up a base of fire to support our assault elements, then we absolutely should. And it is possible to get long lines of sight in urban terrain. Some types of urban areas are less dense than others. They can be parks, markets, or squares that offer a lot of open space. And there are always the rooftops and multi-storey buildings. The high ground in urban areas might look a little different than it does out in the country, but it's still the high ground and it gives us all the same advantages of observation and arcs of fire. So that's a quick look at firefights in an urban context. There is a lot more to urban warfare than this, but this should hopefully be some help. The Alamara scenario is definitely worth a playthrough. I managed to force the AI to surrender with 1 pixel Truppen dead and 7 wounded, plus 2 strikers destroyed, so have a go. I think it's a good battle for getting to grips with fighting in people's houses. That's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.